Hello. Today I thought I would spend a little bit of time talking about a question that we pastors occasionally get asked, and that question is, how do I go about choosing a Bible? And that's understandably confusing. I mean, there is just an alphabet soup of different versions of the Bible out there. There's the ASV, the NIV, the KJV, the NRSV, the TNIV, the CEB, EIEIO. It's completely understandable that some folks would be confused by all of these different versions. So how do you know which one you should get? How do you know what the difference is? How do you go about making that choice? Okay, the first thing to understand is that what makes different versions of the Bible different is different translations, as opposed to different editions, which just means they contain different things between the covers. So for instance, there's the HarperCollins Study Bible, which is a New Revised Standard Version Bible. There's also the Lutheran Study Bible, which is also a New Revised Standard Version Bible. Those are two different editions of the same version or translation. What that means is the text of Scripture itself in both of them is the same. The footnotes and the study helps and the maps and those kinds of things that are in them, in addition to the text, are different. So, how do we decide on a version or a translation? The first thing to know is that every translation of anything that ever gets translated from one language to another involves some degree of interpretation. If you think about it, for instance, we have all kinds of different words in English for liquid precipitation that falls from the sky. Now, the general term for that is rain, but if you think about it, we have other terms for it too. Drizzle, mist, fog, downpour, cloudburst, all of these different versions to describe the same thing. All of these different words to describe the same thing. And those different words carry a different sense, a different nuance in their meaning. And so translators, when they are translating anything, but especially when they're translating Scripture, have to make decisions about which word do I choose? Which word best carries the sense and the intention of the original text in this place? And translators make some different philosophical choices about how they're going to translate before they begin. One of the first questions they have to decide is, are we going to go with formal equivalence or dynamic equivalence? Now, formal equivalence is we're going to go word for word and we're going to translate each and every word in the best way that we can, the most exact synonym, even if it maybe sacrifices some of the readability, makes the text a little less easily understood. Dynamic equivalence, on the other hand, says, we're going to try our best to carry the sense of the passage, and that may mean that we use a word that isn't an exact synonym or an exact translation of the word in Scripture, but that we feel carries the best intent of the passage. Now you notice I'm saying we, not I. And that's because the best translations are done by teams rather than individuals. There are translations out there that are done by individuals, and they're fine. Some of them are actually pretty good. In fact, Martin Luther, when he translated the Bible into German, largely did it by himself. There was an individual translation. William Tyndale translated the Bible into English around the same time as an individual translation. But the best translations are done by teams of people because they can kind of check each other's work and make sure that there aren't biases slipping into the translation work. And the best team translations, the best translating teams, decide what their policies and their approach to translation is going to be before they begin. So they make that decision about dynamic equivalence or formal equivalence, for instance, before they actually start the work of translating. Now, when it comes to English translations of the Bible, the granddaddy of them all is the King James Version. It's not the first English translation of the Bible, but it is probably the most common and the one that has stood the test of time the longest. Now, the first Bibles were translated into English sometime in the 1300s. We don't know a whole lot about a lot of those Bibles because translating the Bible into English in the 13 and into the 1400s was a dangerous act. It was actually forbidden by the church, and you could actually lose your head over it. In fact, the first widespread English translation of the Bible, the first one that was actually printed on a printing press as opposed to hand-copied and handwritten out, was the Tyndale Bible, translated by William Tyndale in about 1525. So about the same time Luther was translating the Bible into German. Tyndale's translation was an individual translation, and it got him into a lot of trouble. In fact, he had to go into hiding after his translation of the Bible was published. And in fact, in 1536, he was caught, arrested, tried for heresy for having translated the Bible without authorization, and then burned at the stake. So translating the Bible was kind of risky business back then. Fast forward about 80 years from William Tyndale, and things have changed. The English have split from the Church of Rome. There is now the Church of England, as distinct from the Roman Catholic Church, and the King of England is seen as the head of the Church of England. And so King James I of England decides that we really need a good English translation of the Bible. And so he calls together a group of bishops and other clergy and biblical scholars and puts a group of those people to work on an English translation. There are 47 different men working on the translation, and they were all men. And those 47 guys were divided up into 6 panels. And each of those 6 panels took a section of the Bible to work on. It took them 7 years to finish their translation. They started in 1604, and they finished the translation and published it in 1611. And that translation is the same translation we have today as the King James Bible, or sometimes called the Authorized Version. Now, here's the thing about the King James Version. It is a brilliant, beautiful translation. It is very accurate. Most modern biblical scholars will tell you it is a very good scholarly translation of the Bible. The problem with the King James Version, though, is that English has changed a little bit in the last 400 years. If you're not sure what I mean by that, turneth on thy television, and listeneth to them what speaketh, and see if you completely understandeth thy language. You get the idea. We just talk differently. We use different vocabulary and different verbs, and we don't have all of the ruffles and flourishes that were part of King James English. And so for us as modern readers, sometimes the King James is a little tough to understand. It can be a little hard to chew through and digest all of the differences in the English to get to what the text actually means. So if you like the King James Version and you can handle the 17th century English with the these and the thys and the thous, by all means go for it. It's a good translation. Read it and enjoy. But if you have some trouble with the 16th century English, you might want a more modern translation. And the good news is there are a lot of really good modern translations out there. One question that some people ask is, what is the most popular translation of the Bible? And that's kind of a tricky question to answer. In 2014, a survey was done that asked that question. Do you read the Bible? And if you do, what version do you read? Of the people who said, yes, I read the Bible on a regular basis, 55% of them said they read the King James Version. 19% said they use the New International Version, the NIV, and then all of the other versions had less than 10% each. Here's the thing, though. Of those 55% who say they read the King James Version, my hunch is that most of them own the King James Version. My hunch is also that most of them do not on a regular basis read or study from the King James Version. It's kind of like grandma's china. You revere it, it's beautiful, you want to treasure it and keep it sacred, but you don't actually pull it out and read it very often. So, modern translations. A couple of the most commonly known and most commonly used modern translations are the New International Version, the NIV, and it's even got a slightly more modern update called the TNIV, or Today's New International Version, and the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, which, as the name implies, is a more modern version of the Revised Standard Version. So what's the difference between the two? Well, you remember a minute ago I talked about formal equivalence versus dynamic equivalence. The New International Version leans more in the direction of formal equivalence. The NIV tends to translate word for word rather than phrase for phrase. The NRSV tends to go for a more dynamic equivalence approach, more trying to get the sense that was intended by the original, and so therefore sometimes we'll use a slightly different word. So that's kind of the difference between those two versions and between these two different approaches. The version that we tend to use in worship in our churches is the New Revised Standard Version. And it's also the version that is the most common among biblical scholars, the version that is the most popular English translation with biblical scholars. That's not to say there's anything wrong with the NIV. It's just a matter of understanding what is the approach taken by both of these Bibles. They're both translated by teams, they're both translated by really excellent biblical scholars, but they have a slightly different approach. So that brings us back to this original question: how do I know which Bible is right for me? Which one should I use? My answer to that question is the one you will actually read and understand. Because a mediocre translation that you will actually pull out and read is much better than a superb translation that's going to sit on your shelf and gather dust. By all means, find the translation that you are the most comfortable with. For some people, that's the Good News Bible. Is it a super accurate, scholarly translation? Not as accurate as some. But it's better to read a Good News Bible than to have an NRSV Bible sit on your shelf and gather dust. Another thing to think about is, do I want a study Bible or do I want a text-only Bible? A study Bible is generally going to have lots of footnotes that explain things in the text. It'll probably have some maps. It'll probably have some information about other possible translations of that particular verse. It'll have all kinds of additional study helps. Another version or edition of the same Bible may only have the text of Scripture itself. No footnotes, none of that other stuff. Which one do you need or want? Kind of depends on you. I will tell you that when I'm preparing for Bible study, or I'm preparing for a class, or I'm preparing a sermon, I use a study Bible. I use an NRSV study Bible that's got all of the footnotes and all that extra stuff in there to help open up the text. But for my own devotional reading, I use a text-only Bible. I use one that is just the text of Scripture. And the reason I do that is because if I have a study Bible with all of those footnotes and other stuff, I have this tendency to get sucked into the footnotes rather than doing a devotional reading of Scripture itself. If you can read a study Bible for your own devotional use, great, by all means do so. I tend to view Bibles the way golfers look at golf clubs. Different Bibles are the right tool for different situations. Now that might seem a little bit sacrilegious, but let's think about this. If you really get down to it, the Bible is a tool. It's a tool to help us know and understand God. And therefore, the best tool is the one that you're actually the most likely to use. One other thing to be aware of when it comes to choosing a Bible, there are a lot of really great Bible apps out there. If you have a smartphone or you have a computer, which I'm guessing you do since you're watching this video, you can find all kinds of great Bible study helps and great Bible texts out there, either on the internet or as apps for your phone. One of my favorite apps, and the one that I actually use fairly often, is called Bible Gateway. And I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but it has the text of Scripture right there on the page, and it has 53 different English versions that you can choose from. The really great thing there is you can actually compare. Well, how did the translators of the NIV render this sentence? Or how did the translators of the NRSV render it? And how did the translators of the American Standard Version translate it? And you can look at and compare those different translations, and sometimes that's helpful to give us a little bit deeper understanding of what this text really means and is trying to say to us. So I strongly recommend be aware of and use some of those digital versions and online helps for Bible study. In addition to those different apps, there are some really good hard copy printed study Bibles out there. Some of the really good ones are the HarperCollins Study Bible and the Oxford Study Bible, both of which are New Revised Standard Version. The Concordia Study Bible is a very good New International Version study Bible, and there are others out there. The Lutheran Bible that was published a few years ago by Augsburg Fortress is pretty good. There are some Bibles with their footnotes and things specifically geared to women, or specifically geared to youth, or specifically geared to men. There are all kinds of different versions and helps out there. And again, the one that is the best is the one that you'll actually pull out, open up, and read. Because our Bibles do us no good if they just sit on our shelf and gather dust. And they don't do us much more good if we pull them out and open them up and read them, but don't really understand what we're reading. So I hope that's helpful. I hope it helps you make some choices about how to choose a Bible. And I hope you actually will try some of these out. Take them for a test drive. Some of the apps are free. Some of the Bible translations that are available online are available for free. Give them a whirl. See which one speaks to you the most. And by all means, dive into Scripture. And as you do, listen for where God might be speaking to you through these words. If you read something and you don't understand it, that's okay. Keep going. You might come back later and understand that passage in a whole new way. Anyway, as I said, I hope that's helpful, and happy reading. Until next time, take care. God bless.